Soroush to join us briefly, like should be here soon. Just sit tight and we'll get started. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, are we live?
Yes, we are live. So we can get started. So welcome to the workshop, everyone. This is Intro to Information Architecture by Soroush Toloue, who is a lead product designer at Electronic Arts and has experience in UI, UX, and interaction design. So I'll let him take it away.
Thank you for that intro. Let me go ahead and share my screen here so we can get started. Okay, so my name is Soroush Toloue. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm a UX designer and accessibility evangelist. A little bit about me. So I began my career back in 2001. I've worked with some of these companies as an information architect as well as a UX designer in the past. Now, let's talk a little bit about information architect. We're going to talk a little bit about the history, the disciplines involved, the deliverables, and how to produce a sitemap. So a little bit about the history. It began by this man named Richard Saul Wehrman in the 1970s. He's a graphic designer, a building architect, as well as a co-founder of the TEDx conferences. What is information architecture? Information architecture is a professional practice and a field of studies focusing on the solving of the basic problems of accessing and using vast amounts of information. So you may have heard this term as it relates to design of websites and apps, wireframes, content, label, navigation, etc. The main disciplines involved in information architecture are as follows. We're going to talk a little bit about each and every one of them. They are library science, archiving, cataloging, building architecture, and cognitive psychology. So library science is the study of how to categorize and catalog and locate resources. You would see this in particularly in large spaces where you would need to find your information around, such as hospitals, museums, or airports. An example of this would be the terminals that you would see and the gates in order to find your way around in a large space. Archiving is the process of building and curating archives filled with content that may need to be edited, removed, in the future in order to maintain the integrity of the archives. So, for example, if you have a blog with many, many posts, deciding which posts to archive, to delete, to maintain is very important. Basically, understanding what's relevant to your audience is an important aspect of archival science. Cataloging is the process of creating metadata, that is data about data, and assigning it to content in order to find it again. So if you're familiar with search engine optimization, this is something that search engine optimizations utilize in order to help you get to your content. So if you search for something using a keyword or a hashtag or a meta description, that's the kind of information an information architect curates in order for the users to find that information again. Building architecture itself is a process and the product of planning, designing, and constructing building and other structures. So in terms of building architecture, we have blueprints, which are the same or the equivalent of wireframes in case of information architecture. And last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology is the study of how the mind works and the mental processes that take place there. As an information architect, you may need to focus on three things, mainly cognitive load, mental models, and decision making. Mental models are a way a user thinks some product or service may work, for example, based on their previous experiences. For example, if you were to get into a new bike or a new car, you would use your previous knowledge of how previous cars or bikes have worked in order to get on with the task. Same thing again for cognitive load. Cognitive load is something that, for example, shopping lists are difficult in terms of cognitive load for you to remember, or phone numbers are difficult for you to remember from a cognitive load perspective. And one of the ways we could truncate this information and break it down for phone numbers is through the use of area codes and the prefix and the 4 unique identifiers for you, instead of putting it all under the same 10 digits, which would make it difficult to understand. And again, with decision making is the process of making a decision between 2 items or multiple items and how it can be used from a user perspective to decide between the two various content on your site. So understanding that is important. Now, let's talk a little bit about the deliverables that an information architect is responsible for. This by no means is all of them, but these are some of them that you could take a look at. For example, sitemaps, content audits you could produce, content inventories, content models, mental models, taxonomy, metadata, organizational schema, and labeling systems. And we're going to show you examples of each and every one of them. For example, sitemaps here. Sitemap is a page or a file where you would produce to your stakeholders, where you would list all the pages and all the content that you have within the website in a hierarchical fashion under the same roof. And you show the relationship between them through the use of lines, as you can see here. Another example is here, where you see all the boxes, all the lines, all the structures, the hierarchies, the labels, as well as the legend. And a legend is very important to be included in the sitemap. So you can see, starting with the homepage, you would see all the links that the website can have, all the subcategories, and they're all structurally laid out. This is another good example where you would see the different levels inside the sitemap. You would see the page IDs associated with each individual page, and if they have subcategories, you would see how they're labeled as such. So with the About Us, you go from left to right, starting with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if they have subcategories, you say 1.1, 1.2, et cetera, et cetera. Content audits, again, to understand what you already have on your current website in order to determine what you need to create from a content perspective, what you need to update, what you need to rewrite and or delete. A good example of a content inventory is this example, where you would see all the page IDs, the topic of the page, the topic description, the URL, the status. So 200 means it's live, 404 means it's missing, the levels, which are again based on the sitemap, the page title, the meta description, the meta keywords, as well as the document type. So this is a comprehensive content inventory example. Content models, again, just to show your stakeholders how each pieces of content is organized and how they relate to one another. For example, in this example, you will see what happens if you become a customer. What are the key feature products that this particular product has? What are the pricing points? What are the promo links? And how they are all laid out, and whether they are useful for the right content, for the right context for the user. Mental models is an example of a deliverable that was popularized by Indy Young. As you can see, up top are the activities that a user goes through on a daily basis, and at the bottom are the products and the services that a business can offer them for those specific activities or tasks. Taxonomy is the labeling of categories and how many items per category you might have. So in this case, geography, you might have 15 articles about London or about 24 about UK, and you list those and you deliver those to your team members. Metadata is the process, if you remember, is the data about the data. In this case, we're taking a look at an IMDb example. So the TV show Mad Men, if you were to break it down into individual episodes, you would describe the title of the episode, the description of it, the date, the type of content that we have. And as an information architect, you get to decide what kind of language gets used here, how many characters, and the tone of it as well. Organization schema, again, this is an example of a deliverable that you could hand off to your dev team to say, hey, for the education organization dropdown, for example, we will have the following labels, and here they are. You can code them accordingly. Labeling systems, again, is a documentation where you put all your labels, all your headers, all your metadata under one roof. In this case, the label of communication, we would see how it would show up at the top of the page, life hack communication, and how it would show up as a title of the page. Now, many people confuse navigation and information architecture. So I want to make this clear that information architecture is the information backbone of the site, and navigation is the elements within the UI that help you reach specific piece of information on the website. So again, navigation is a collection of user interface components that help people move throughout the site or a web or an app. And the primary goal of the navigation is to help users find information and functionality and help them take desirable action, in this case, shop, for example. Now, as an information architect, you want to decide what type of navigation to use, where to use it, and how to use it. So we're going to talk about different types. These are the main types. There are many, many, many more types, but these are the main types that are used. So global or primary, local, utility, footer, in context, and faceted, and we'll see examples of each and every one. So here's an example of a utility nav. They're usually placed on the right top hand side of every website. Here's an example of a global nav. These are the kind of navs that the kind of menu or navigation that shows up in every single page of a website, hence the word global. Footer is usually placed at the bottom of the page. Faceted nav are the kind of nav that show you the different categories and the numbers including in those categories. And in context nav are the kind of navigation that you would see as you're scrolling within the page. They usually involve much more imagery and they're much more contextual. For example, in this case, today's deals. Now, in terms of navigation, you have to take into consideration how much users will rely on this kind of navigation. And then based on that, decide which type of pattern of design is appropriate for your kind of content. Does it work better with tabs, mega menus, carousels, accordions? You would have to consider those kinds of questions. And how it should be presented on the page. Should it be at the bottom? Should it be at the top? Should it be on every page? And those are the kind of questions you would consider. Now, let's talk a little bit about one of the most important deliverables, which is the sitemap, and how to go about creating a sitemap based on an existing site, which is a lot easier than creating it from scratch. So let's talk about that for a second. On an existing site, ideally, here are the steps that you want to take to create a new sitemap. You want to create an existing sitemap of the current site. You want to perform a content inventory to make sure what you have versus what you want to be archiving. And then you would do what is called a card sort. This is where you would take all the navigation and all the content that you have and write them down individually on index cards. And in an open card sort, in this case, is where you would ask participate to categorize those individual index cards into categories and give them a label. That is what's called an open card sort. Once you have those categories and those labels, what you could do is a tree test. This is where, without search, you would ask participants to find the pieces of content that they're looking for, given those categories, names, and labeling that you've done in the open card sort. And if that's successful, you can do a closed card sort where you would just give the labels of the categories to the participants and ask them to categorize the content accordingly. Steps 4 through 8, you could do this iteratively to make sure you get the optimized results. Now, for a new sitemap, for a new website that hasn't existed before, how you want to create a sitemap is basically by understanding the domain or the industry that you're in, whether it's airline or banking. You want to understand the users involved, the tasks involved. You can begin by doing user interviews with the targeted audiences and begin to compile a list of terminology and descriptions and everything else that would ultimately become a taxonomy for your website in terms of your labels, your descriptions, the tone of voice that you want to use, everything that helps your users navigate better. And then you would do the same thing. You would do an open card sort. You would do a tree test, a closed card sort. And if the results of the tree test are above 80%, then you could make your final recommendation. Again, steps from 4 to 8 are iteratively. You could do them iteratively to get the desired effect. Now, let's talk about what are the tools that you could use to help you get there in terms of some of these deliverables, like labeling system and organizations. How are you going to create that? You can create that by doing, again, card sorting, participating in ethnographic studies, as well as doing observational research. Observe your users, how they do things, what language they use, everything else. Same thing with taxonomy and metadata. You could use a number of card sorting exercises, ethnographic studies, as well as observational research. Basically, what you're trying to get at is how people talk, what are the tasks involved, understanding their mental models, and what language to use that would make sense to them. Content and mental models, again, observational research, ethnographical studies, and in this case, you could do in-depth interviews to make sure you capture the qualitative research as well. In terms of navigation validation, there are certain tools. I mentioned tree testing. You could do first click tests. You could do heat maps. So those are some of the tools. Other tools you could use are Optimal Workshop, Usability Hub, User Zoom, or C Inspector. C Inspector does a good job of tree testing. I would highly recommend you check it out. In terms of resources that was used to put together this course, I used W3 Schools, as well as this course by Julia Davari on Skillshare, many of the materials that was borrowed from her. And thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen, and hope that you find it useful. If you have any questions, happy to answer them in the remaining time. If not, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. And yeah, I'll be happy to provide a response. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was very informative. So let's see if we have any questions in the chat. So feel free to post any questions you have and can definitely answer them. In the meantime, I did have a question regarding near the end when you were talking about, well, it was throughout talking about metadata. So in terms of like privacy for like data and like protecting yourself in like digital systems, how would like data classification work into this? So like now there's like the big issue of like privacy within like different interfaces, different media forms. So how is like information architecture kind of like working around that or working with that?
To me, most of what information architecture is all about is about publicly advertising your website. It's about public facing websites, even internal facing websites. Because if you do a good job with the metadata, then most likely other people can find it. Now, if certain people do not have access or shouldn't have access to that information, then it's a programming thing to make sure that the specific permissions do apply. But in terms of your infrastructure and making sure as an information architecture you do your good job, is to be as descriptive as possible. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, that's very interesting. And we do have a few questions here. So, what is some popular advice about breaking into information architecture industry that you would think is actually misleading or actually unhelpful?
I think um, I think most people don't have a targeted approach in terms of information architecture. That, hey, I want to work with whoever who can give me a job, instead of saying, no, I want to work with the top 5 banks, for example, in Canada, or I want to work with the sports industry, and therefore I'm going to design my portfolio that way. I'm going to talk the talk. I'm going to walk the walk exactly the way as, as my goal vision is, or my dream job want me to be. So having that would really help, as well as having a deep knowledge on this. I feel like most people who get into information architecture don't know too much about library science or cognitive psychology or anything like that. They don't go too far deep. So if you have that deep knowledge with a targeted approach and a desired passion, you'll be unstoppable.
Awesome, yeah. And as university students, do you feel like there are specific resources or like any sort of courses or certifications that we can take to kind of like develop that knowledge within information architecture?
I think the more you study the field, no matter where you do it, the more of an expert you would become in the field. And we lack experts in the field. People who are really passionate about content audits, who are really passionate about meta description. Those are rare individuals. So if you can become one of those people and become an expert at it, there are plenty of people who are willing to hire you and pay you and love you.
It's very interesting. Thank you. And we do have another question. So, could you jot the resources for testing? So, I think there is a slide about the resources for
Yeah,
testing. I think the person wanted to see that again.
yeah, absolutely. In terms of resources for testing, yep, I have it right here. I mean, I'm hoping after we could share the same deck with everyone else, but I'll just share some of the tools with you all here. Uh, there we go.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And this is similar to what we kind of touched on earlier, but someone mentioned, as someone who's not in the information architecture industry, what are some important skills in your field that you also frequently see in other fields? So any like overlapping skills?
Yeah, and like to me, if you have a desire for organization, regardless of in even if it's like organizing your closet, you're in, right? Because a lot of what we do as information architect is deal with chaos and how to organize that chaos into a way that is optimized for usage, right? So understanding how you can catalog things, how you can organize things for your users' mental models, that'll be key. So understanding the users, understanding how they think, the language that they use, and how they want this information, and connecting the dot, right?
Like, yeah, and this kind of goes into another question that I had. So like AI and like that's kind of like the big thing happening right now in a lot of industries. So like has AI affected you negatively or kind of benefited the information architecture industry?
I don't think so. It has certainly benefited in terms of like research that you could do, tools that you could use in terms of writing description, in terms of cataloging the information, but still it lacks that human touch of a lot of it has to do with understanding your users and their mental models. Unfortunately, AI is not good at understanding, as far as I know. Um, that hey, these people need this and they need another human being to make sure that the information gets shown to them in the right way, in the right language, and in the right context, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's kind of like the pitfalls of AI. And we do have another
Yeah.
question. So, when you're making sitemaps, how deep do you go? So, do you include different sections within a page? So, like, are there like subsections within sitemaps?
No, so with the sitemap, you could go into your individual pages or individual PDF files or files that you have within a website. How many levels you have is up to you. But the point of the sitemap is to capture everything. Now, if you want to go deeper than that, content inventory is a good tool for that. So that content inventory not only breaks down all the sitemap and all the content we have, but it breaks down individual pages as well. So in that About Us page, we have an H1, we have a paragraph, we have an image, we have a button, and then you can list all that in the content inventory.
Okay. And kind of similar to that, are there like any challenges within, like when you're first starting with information architecture, is there like a big learning curve or are there like common challenges that you see with a lot of people?
Yeah, a lot of people panic because, again, the whole field is about dealing with vast amounts of information. And as an information architect, guess what? The first thing that happens, they bring a big stack of papers and documents and land them on your desk, and they're like, sort through this chaos and mess. So, not to panic initially, and basically turn on that side of your brain that craves organization and cataloging and everything else and loves testing, right? A lot of it has to do with testing to make sure that the final product works for the end users. And as an information architect or as any of the product making team, we are not the end users. We're in fact, I've been working in IT for a while, so we're not the end users. We have to make sure it works for the end users. So do a lot of testing, do a lot of research, and enjoy documentation, I guess, like long lists. As a designer, for me, making lists is not why I got into design. So it depends on why you got into this in the first place. But if you're focused on just building the backbone of a website without all the fancy look and feel and make sure every information is great and at the right time, at the right moment, then yeah, that's the job.
So, thank you so much. And let's see. So I did have one more question. So you mentioned that there's like the different levels of organizing the information. Are there like so like within the organizing the information, are there like different structures and like different ways that people tend to kind of accommodate it for themselves? So like if you were to work on a project with someone else, would they have different methods or is everything kind of very streamlined and like very structured, not very much like alteration for each person?
So information architecture, the way we have it right now in the industry, is not a pure science, but it's more like an applied art. So anyone you run into might have their own definition of information architecture, their own ways of working with it. And there's not a lot of great deal of documentation on it because, like I said, resources are lacking, people passionate about the subject are lacking. So this is part of the reason I'm doing this, to inspire some of you guys to get into this. And because we need it, right? Imagine going to the airport, no signage, right? No, or the library. What are you going to do? Same thing with the website. Vast amounts of information, no signage, no categorization, you're going to be lost. So we need it.
Thank you so much. And I believe those are all the questions that we have. So thank you so much for joining us today and for kind of imparting this information for a lot of us. I'm sure like a lot of us weren't really like introduced to information architecture, but we do have one more question. So we'll get to that and then
Sure.
we can move through then. So could you recommend any websites or apps that have well executed information architecture and can serve as inspiration?
Website off the top of my head, I would say, 1 second.
Yeah.
Like typical large websites could come to mind, like Yahoo, Amazon, especially if you look at where they came from 5, 6 years ago, where they would just show you everything under the sun. Here's everything that I've got on Amazon versus now that it's all personalized based on you, based on your uh, purchase history and everything else. So taking a look at large websites that are doing well, like YouTube, right? Thousands of videos. How are you going to categorize all these videos? Or famous blogs or famous news websites, right? New York Times. How are you going to categorize all this information, right? Those are the kind of things you need to take a look at and learn from, I would say.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And there's also, for the participants watching, feel free to use the participation form to put in your 4-letter passcode. So yeah, I think that's it for today. But if there are any more questions, like Soroush mentioned, would you like to post your LinkedIn in the comments so that people can access it?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just do that right now.
Thank you so much.
And
So
yeah.
feel free to access the LinkedIn, ask more questions, or just talk about information architecture. So thank you again so much, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you. You too. I hope you find